I've spent decades wandering through the landscapes of consciousness, peering into the hidden corners of the human mind, and watching the subtle patterns that seem to repeat across cultures, across lifetimes, across the faint echo of human stories. I've seen the way people almost instinctively fall into roles that seem as old as the earth itself, and I've noticed the way certain individuals move through life, leaving trails of energy that can either elevate or drain everyone around them. And I cannot help but speak of it, because the moment I observe these patterns, I feel a responsibility to share the truth, to cast light upon the invisible currents that guide our interactions, whether we recognize them or not. I remember the first time I truly saw the perpetual victim. It was in a small cafe in New York, late one rainy evening. The man I was talking to spoke with a calm, almost proud tone about the betrayals he had endured, the friends who had abandoned him, the lovers who had deceived him, the universe itself that seemed to conspire against his happiness. And as I listened, I realized that this was not mere storytelling. This was identity. Every word, every pause, every subtle shake of the head conveyed that he had made the experience of being wronged into the very core of who he was. I tried to ask him gently if perhaps there was a way in which he contributed to the situations that unfolded. The question hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable, and his eyes narrowed. I could see the thought of self-reflection as a kind of danger to him, a threat to the fragile yet rigid narrative he carried. I understood in that moment that you cannot trust a person like this, not because they are cruel or evil or even malicious, but because they are bound by their psychology. They require a source of suffering, a person, a circumstance, a moment in which they can be justified, affirmed, and comforted in the identity of the wounded. I thought about how many people I have seen drawn to them, how many friends and lovers and colleagues would enter into the orbit of this perpetual victim, believing that their compassion could heal them, only to discover that their efforts were never enough, that the energy they poured in was not met with growth, but with demand, that the moment they faltered, the tables would turn, and they too would become part of the story, the next figure in the long saga of betrayal and injury. And then there is the chronic manipulator, a type I first recognized in the winding hallways of academic conferences where the subtle dance of power and charm is almost sacred. I had met a woman, radiant and soft-spoken, who could make an entire room bend to her will without ever raising her voice. She would speak of her difficulties, her burdens, the weight of the world upon her shoulders, and before you knew it, you were entangled in her web, solving problems she never asked you to solve, correcting injustices she barely mentioned, all the while thinking you were acting out of your own volition. And yet, the more I watched her, the more I understood the invisible machinery at work. Every plea, every sigh, every expression of subtle discomfort was calculated, not in a cold mechanical sense, but in a way that had become second nature to her, instinctual, as if she had evolved through countless social interactions to master the art of extracting energy from others without seeming to touch them. You cannot trust this person, not because they wish you harm, but because they cannot see the world except through the lens of leverage, influence, and advantage. I remember feeling simultaneously captivated and wary, drawn in by the human warmth they projected, yet simultaneously aware of the strings that subtly tugged at my own responses, my empathy, my desire to be helpful. And I realized that the manipulator's world is a world of illusions, where connection is always transactional, and where no one ever exists purely for themselves, but for the needs and outcomes they can generate in others. Then there is the righteous crusader. I first met someone of this type at a small seminar on Eastern philosophy in San Francisco. A young man, eyes bright with certainty, voice ringing with the kind of moral absolutism that leaves no room for nuance, explained to me that the path he had discovered, whether spiritual, political, or moral, was the one truth in a world of chaos. I tried to offer alternative perspectives, to introduce the possibility that perhaps wisdom lies not in certainty but in embracing the unknowable, but he could not hear me. His mind was already constructed as a fortress around his beliefs. I watched, fascinated and concerned, as he carefully positioned everyone else as either enlightened or misguided, as either an ally or a threat. And I understood that the Crusaders' absolute conviction is both armor and weapon. They cannot be trusted because they are incapable of true dialogue. Every interaction is a test, every conversation a battlefield, every friendship conditional upon your agreement with their worldview. I reflected on how easy it is for someone like this to alienate themselves while remaining convinced of their own righteousness. Their energy is not destructive in the crude sense, it is corrosive. Slowly, imperceptibly, they erode the space around them, bending it to the contours of their own certainty, leaving little room for ambiguity, mystery, or the messy beauty of not knowing. And yet, I felt a strange compassion for them. They are often frightened, terrified of the vast unknown, desperate for stability, clinging to dogma as a drowning person clings to a piece of driftwood. To trust them, to believe that they could be different, is to misunderstand the architecture of fear upon which their personality rests. The chronic liar is another fascinating type. I first noticed them in the world of intellectual salons, where the performance of intelligence often blends seamlessly with deception. A chronic liar is not simply someone who tells falsehoods. They are someone for whom truth is a flexible instrument, molded to serve the immediate purpose. I have seen these individuals weave a tapestry of partial truths, selective memories, and invented narratives so skillfully that one cannot discern where honesty ends and fabrication begins. Their presence is like walking along the edge of a cliff. You sense the instability beneath your feet, the precariousness of the ground, yet you are compelled to continue, fascinated by the audacity of the structure, the elegance of the construction. I remember once engaging with a man whose entire career seemed a testament to invention. Not malicious invention, but invention nevertheless. Every story he told was plausible, beautifully crafted, but upon closer observation, the patterns emerged, contradictions, improbable coincidences, and underlying fluidity of identity. I realized that the chronic liar cannot be trusted, not because they intend harm, but because they have no anchor in reality. Their life is a performance, and everyone around them is cast as audience, prop, or unwitting participant. To engage with them without awareness is to step into a hall of mirrors where your perception bends and shifts with every reflection. And the truth is always slightly out of reach. And then there is the user. I first recognized this type in the circles of artistic collaboration. Someone who exudes warmth, charm, and enthusiasm, drawing you in with their vision, only for you to realize that your contributions, your energy, your resources are merely instruments in their larger project. At first it feels flattering, exhilarating even to be seen in this way, but gradually the pattern reveals itself. Attention and care only flow when you provide utility. Absence or decline in usefulness is met with distance, polite dismissal, or calculated indifference. I watched as talented friends poured their energy into these relationships, only to feel used, depleted, and invisible once the initial purpose was served. I understood then that the user cannot be trusted because the relationship is fundamentally conditional. Connection exists only as long as it serves their ends, and this conditionality is invisible until one is thoroughly invested. I noticed the envious destroyer long before I fully understood the subtle violence of their presence. They do not announce themselves with fury or hostility. Rather, they exist as shadows just beyond the light of your achievements. I have seen them appear as friends, as colleagues, as allies, and yet beneath the surface, their perception of your growth or happiness triggers a quiet, corrosive reaction. The first time I encountered such a person, I was speaking at a small gathering in Cambridge. A friend, seemingly supportive, subtly undermined my work, pointing out minor flaws in a tone of concern, praising others' achievements while diminishing mine. It took weeks for me to recognize the pattern. Every success I experienced was met with covert resistance, every moment of triumph shadowed by a small, precise act of sabotage or critique. The envious destroyer cannot be trusted because their joy in your accomplishments is conditional, often impossible. Their energy is calibrated to neutralize the light of others, not to enhance it. In time, I realized that proximity to such individuals exacts a toll on the mind. Subtle anxiety, self-doubt, and hesitation begin to seep in. Their unconscious drive to diminish others operates invisibly until the pattern is undeniable. Awareness is the only safeguard, but awareness alone does not fully protect you from the slow drain they impose. The chaos merchant is perhaps the most exhausting type of all. I first noticed this pattern in the life of a woman I knew in the Pacific Northwest. Her existence was a series of self-perpetuating emergencies, disasters, and conflicts. Every solution was temporary, every resolution fleeting. I watched as the turbulence she created seemed to accelerate whenever calm approached, as if equilibrium itself was intolerable. She thrived in intensity, in constant motion, in the upheaval of those around her. I understood then that some people are addicted to chaos in a way comparable to the addict's dependence on the substance. The storm becomes identity, the crisis becomes validation, and those who enter their orbit are swept along, unwitting participants in a narrative they did not write but are compelled to follow. Her presence was simultaneously magnetic and destructive. To be near her was to feel alive in a charged, unpredictable way, yet at the cost of one's own stability. I realized that no intervention could stabilize this energy. Any attempt to impose calm was met with subtle resistance, as if the universe itself conspired to maintain the turbulence. The chaos merchant cannot be trusted because their life is inherently unstable, and those who enter it are inevitably pulled into the whirlwind, losing themselves in the process. I began to observe these patterns not only in others, but within myself. I saw the faint traces of the perpetual victim in moments of self-pity, the manipulator when I tempted myself to influence outcomes subtly, the righteous crusader when I became too attached to a particular worldview or idea. Awareness alone, I learned, is not enough. The task is to disentangle oneself from these unconscious patterns, to recognize them as expressions of the human mind rather than immutable truths of character. I became obsessed with understanding the mechanics of personality, the hidden rules that govern behavior, and the subtle interplay of needs, fears, and desires that drive human interaction. Over time, I realized that these 7 types, the perpetual victim, the chronic manipulator, the righteous crusader, the chronic liar, the user, the envious destroyer, and the chaos merchant, are not related anomalies. They are archetypes that emerge in the human psyche when certain needs or fears are left unexamined. They are extreme manifestations of tendencies that exist to some degree in all of us. Recognizing them in others allows a kind of protective clarity, but recognizing them in oneself is far more challenging. Self-awareness requires brutal honesty and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about one's motivations, patterns, and impulses. I remember a period of intense observation when I traveled alone across the deserts of Arizona, watching the human interactions around me, observing friends, strangers, and even myself. I realized that the patterns I had cataloged are like gravity, inescapable, invisible forces that pull us into repetition unless we consciously act otherwise. The perpetual victim seeks external blame, the manipulator seeks hidden leverage, the crusader seeks validation for certainty, the liar constructs flexible realities, the user measures value and utility, the destroyer reacts to others' light, and the chaos merchant creates storms of intensity. Each archetype carries its own internal logic, its own psychological imperative, and each exerts influence on the world in ways that are both subtle and profound. What struck me most was the interplay between these types. The manipulator and the user often found themselves in complex entanglements, each seeking advantage, each unknowingly feeding the other's strategy. The crusader and the destroyer, when proximate, generated conflict that seemed predestined, their energies irreconcilable yet magnetically drawn together. I began to see that human relationships are less about conscious choice than about the gravitational pull of archetypal patterns, the invisible choreography of psyche. My fascination with this led me to a profound realization. The most critical skill in life is discernment, the ability to perceive these patterns in others and in oneself, and the wisdom to act in alignment with reality rather than illusion. I have spent nights pondering how these archetypes persist across time, across cultures, and across circumstances. I saw the same patterns in ancient texts, in tribal societies, and in modern corporate environments. The forms are different, but the dynamics are consistent. The perpetual victim existed in the epics of Homer as the tragic figure betrayed by fate. The manipulator walked the streets of Renaissance Florence, charming, deceiving, advancing. The crusader has always marched with certainty, whether in the desert or the boardroom. The liar, the user, the destroyer, the chaos merchant, all are timeless, and all reveal something essential about the human mind, that unless we cultivate self-awareness and conscious responsibility, we are drawn into repetition, into patterns that limit our freedom, distort our perception, and entangle us in lives not fully our own. I came to understand that trust is the most delicate of currencies, and it is placed in the hands of these types, it is often spent or manipulated without acknowledgement. Trust is not naivete. It is an investment of attention, energy, and vulnerability. To extend it wisely requires perception, courage, and sometimes ruthless clarity. I have learned that to navigate life successfully, one must balance compassion with discernment, empathy with vigilance, generosity with awareness. These 7 archetypes, when understood, are not simply threats. They are mirrors, reflections of parts of ourselves, warnings and guides. Recognizing them allows us to move more deliberately through the human landscape, to choose where to invest our energy, and to avoid being unwittingly drawn into narratives not our own. I began to test this understanding, observing interactions in both public and private spaces, noting how energy flowed, where patterns repeated, and when individuals unconsciously assumed the roles I had identified. I watched as the perpetual victim subtly framed others as oppressors, as the manipulator subtly redirected attention and resources, as the crusader imposed frameworks of belief and morality, as the liar shaped reality for convenience, as the user calculated utility and abandonment, as the destroyer reacted with unconscious sabotage, and as the chaos merchant stirred storms of intensity. Each instance reinforced the necessity of clarity, the vital importance of seeing without distortion, without the wishful hope that the archetype might behave differently than it inherently does. It became evident to me that human relationships are less about chance than about the interplay of forces within consciousness. Each interaction carries with it echoes of archetypal energy. One may think one is acting freely, but subtle psychological currents are at play, guiding choices, shaping perceptions, and often determining outcomes before conscious decision intervenes. I began to see that mastery is not about controlling others, but about recognizing these forces and orienting oneself in alignment with awareness rather than unconscious compulsion. The perpetual victim will continue to seek validation of suffering. The manipulator will continue to extract advantage. The crusader will continue to insist on certainty. The liar will continue to reshape reality. The user will continue to employ utility. The destroyer will continue to respond to brilliance with subtle diminishment, and the chaos merchant will continue to generate turbulence. These are not moral failures, but expressions of unexamined psychic imperatives. I realize that the challenge is not simply to avoid these types, but to understand them, to see them as expressions of the human condition. Awareness of the archetype allows one to navigate the interaction without being pulled into the unconscious dance. I began to experiment with observing without attachment, interacting without absorption, offering energy without surrendering to manipulation. It was a delicate practice requiring constant attention, reflection, and the willingness to acknowledge one's own vulnerabilities and susceptibilities. In the presence of these types, I learned to cultivate a quiet interior clarity, a steady observation that allowed me to act in alignment with intention rather than reflex, to preserve energy, maintain dignity, and remain conscious amidst the currents of unconscious patterns. I began to notice how these archetypes ripple through the world, not as isolated individuals, but as forces subtle yet undeniable, shaping communities, workplaces, friendships, even entire cultures. The perpetual victim is everywhere, wearing invisible chains of blame and sorrow, and the world bends slightly in response, accommodating their pain, reinforcing it without ever intending to. I have seen businesses brought to inertia, collaborations falter, families fracture, all because the energy of victimhood demanded recognition, demanded validation, demanded the space to be wronged continuously. I saw how easy it is for this archetype to attract the compassionate, the idealistic, the naive, those who believe their empathy can rewrite someone else's narrative. But the lesson is always the same. Energy follows recognition, and what is recognized grows. If you nourish the identity of suffering, it becomes a fortress. The perpetual victim cannot evolve while the world pays homage to their woundedness. I have felt it myself, a quiet temptation to linger in self-justification, to look outward and blame circumstance, to permit anger or regret to become an identity. Recognition is the first step, not indulgence. The manipulator, too, becomes visible on a grander scale when observed as a force. I have watched them in social networks subtly bending dynamics without anyone noticing, exerting influence through charm, empathy, and the strategic deployment of guilt. One does not encounter manipulators merely in one-on-one interactions. They exist in the architecture of human systems. Their energy moves unseen, bending outcomes, shaping behavior, directing attention and loyalty toward themselves. I have studied the way they operate. Their attention is deliberate, almost surgical, and their intent is unspoken. The manipulator thrives in complexity, in the intricate web of social bonds, and anyone who enters that web is immediately subject to subtle currents of persuasion and control. I have noticed that the manipulator's power is not coercion, not blunt force, but the quiet, insidious shaping of perception, the quiet rearrangement of emotional landscapes, so that others act in alignment with the manipulator's unseen design. Awareness of this is liberating, for once the mechanics are observed, the grip weakens. The righteous crusader, however, is perhaps the most fascinating to observe from a distance. I have seen them on lecture stages, in parliaments, and in online forums, constructing universes of truth that exclude the messy, the ambiguous, the unknown. They demand compliance, insist upon agreement, and punish deviation with social, emotional, or intellectual exile. I remember listening to one man speak with absolute certainty about the proper path to enlightenment, dismissing centuries of thought, diverse traditions, and complex human experience as irrelevant. Yet in witnessing this, I realized that the Crusaders' drive is not purely external. It is a defense, a protective armor against the terrifying vastness of unknowing. Their insistence upon truth, upon certainty, is a survival mechanism. To interact with them without awareness is to enter a battlefield where ideas become swords, friendship conditional, and curiosity weaponized. I have felt the magnetic pull of this archetype, the intoxicating power of belief that shapes reality itself, yet I have also felt the danger, the slow erosion of my own capacity to see beyond the boundaries they impose. The chronic liar operates differently, and the danger they present is woven into the fabric of perception itself. I have encountered individuals whose words were fluid, bending, reshaping themselves to fit circumstance. Reality is malleable to them, truth subordinate to necessity. I have seen how easily this sows confusion, subtle distrust, and instability. You think you understand them, but the ground beneath shifts constantly, and the line between honesty and falsehood blurs. They are actors in a drama with no script, improvising reality, drawing others into scenes whose outlines they alone perceive. The chronic liar cannot be confronted in conventional terms, for their foundation is not deceit alone, but a profound disconnection from principle, from consistency, from the stabilizing structures that allow trust to emerge. Observation is the only safeguard, and even then, engagement requires vigilance, patience, and acceptance of instability. The user, as an archetype, functions like a gravitational force. I have felt it in professional circles, artistic collaborations, and intimate relationships. Their attention is conditional, their generosity calculated, and the moment utility ends, distance manifests effortlessly. I have watched people sacrifice themselves in service of those who would later discard them, all because of the illusion of genuine connection, the subtle misperception of care as intrinsic rather than transactional. The user cannot be reformed by good intentions or generosity. Their psychology is designed to optimize input-output, not to cultivate reciprocity or emotional depth. Awareness allows you to protect energy, preserve focus, and avoid exploitation, but the lessons are hard, often learned only through observation and experience. I came to see the envious destroyer not merely as a type, but as a force of entropy in human networks. I observed how envy, often hidden beneath the veneer of concern, caution, or criticism, subtly eroded joy, creativity, and confidence. Proximity to this energy imposes doubt, fosters hesitation, and generates a pervasive sense of being measured, assessed, and diminished. I have felt it in friendships, in professional mentorships, and in families, where subtle acts, remarks, and interventions create patterns that destabilize others' progress. The envious destroyer cannot be negotiated with using reason or logic alone, for their impulse is unconscious, deeply embedded, and emotionally charged. One can only recognize distance and navigate with conscious boundaries. The chaos merchant finally presents a dynamic energy that is almost hypnotic. I have known people whose lives are storm clouds, whose every action generates ripples of disruption, whose presence converts stability into upheaval. I have felt it personally, drawn into dramas that were not mine, witnessing how their relentless need for intensity shapes every environment they inhabit. Their world is perpetual motion, and anyone who enters it is subject to the pull of turbulence. I have seen how difficult it is to extricate oneself without becoming complicit, without being caught in the undertow. Their unpredictability is both magnetizing and destructive, an energy that must be met with constant clarity and the refusal to be swept away. I have developed techniques of observation, detachment, and strategic engagement, learning to maintain my own center while witnessing their storm. These archetypes, as I have observed over the years, are not distant curiosities. They exist in every city, every office, every family, every circle of friends. I have seen how patterns repeat, how they manifest in new forms, yet retain their core dynamics. Awareness becomes not merely a tool of self-protection, but a lens to understand the subtle machinery of human interaction. I have practiced the discipline of recognizing energy without absorption, of interacting with clarity rather than reflex, of maintaining boundaries without hostility. I have realized that the human mind, in its infinite variety, produces patterns that are timeless, recurring, and inescapable unless one cultivates conscious awareness. I have walked the streets of distant cities, observing human behavior, tracing the gravitational pull of these archetypes through social networks, noticing the invisible forces that shape trust, loyalty, friendship, and conflict. The perpetual victim, the manipulator, the crusader, the liar, the user, the destroyer, the chaos merchant. They are everywhere, influencing the flow of energy, directing outcomes, shaping perception, and challenging the observer to maintain equilibrium, clarity, and conscious agency. I have felt, in moments of profound observation, the weight of these archetypes, the gravity of their patterns, and the subtle ways in which they can draw even the most vigilant into repetition and drama. I have reflected on my own susceptibility, recognizing traces of each archetype within myself. I have seen the subtle victim, the manipulator, the crusader, the liar, the user, the destroyer, the chaos merchant, lurking in moments of fear, desire, ambition, and self-justification. Observation is the first step, but the ongoing practice of self-awareness, honesty, and deliberate choice is what allows one to navigate life without being overwhelmed by these forces. I have understood that mastery is not control over others, but control over attention, energy, and perception. The world is filled with archetypal forces, but within the observer exists the potential for conscious navigation, for freedom from unconscious repetition, for alignment with clarity and intentionality. I began to notice the interplay between these archetypes in complex networks, in families, organizations, and social movements. The perpetual victim often attracts the user. The liar entangles with the chaos merchant. The crusader collides with the destroyer. Patterns emerge, subtle and intricate, repeating across time, shaping experiences, and creating outcomes that seem fated, yet are merely the interplay of archetypal energy. I have studied these interactions extensively, understanding the invisible forces, tracing the currents of desire, fear, and unconscious drive. Awareness allows not only survival, but the possibility of mastery, the capacity to navigate consciously, to recognize patterns before being ensnared, and to act in alignment with principles rather than compulsion. As I continued observing these archetypes in motion, I realized that life itself is a mirror of consciousness, a stage upon which the perpetual victim, the manipulator, the crusader, the liar, the user, the destroyer, and the chaos merchant all enact dramas that are as old as humanity itself. The more I watched, the clearer it became that understanding these patterns is not merely a strategy for self-preservation, it is a key to liberation. To see without distortion is to act with clarity. To recognize the invisible forces shaping interactions is to reclaim autonomy. And to understand the archetypes within oneself is to begin the alchemy of consciousness. I have walked through rooms thick with the energy of manipulation, felt the subtle currents of envy ripple beneath polite conversation, and witnessed chaos unfold like a storm through the lives of those I thought were friends. In each instance, I discovered that awareness is not a passive act, but an active force, a conscious participation in the shaping of reality. I recognized the perpetual victim. I no longer allowed myself to be cast as an oppressor. When I observed the manipulator, I ceased to be drawn into the web of subtle coercion. When I identified the crusader, I held my own certainty lightly, refusing to surrender to imposed truths. In seeing the liar, I sought not confrontation, but clarity, differentiating between reality and illusion. In encountering the user, I offered energy strategically, without surrendering autonomy. In the presence of the destroyer, I cultivated resilience, understanding that their reaction reflected their own inner turbulence. And when confronted by the chaos merchant, I anchored myself in stillness, refusing to be swept into perpetual upheaval. This understanding, I realized, is transformative. It changes the way one navigates every interaction, every relationship, every social space. Life ceases to be a series of reactive patterns, and instead becomes a conscious dance. The perpetual victim, the manipulator, the crusader, the liar, the user, the destroyer, and the chaos merchant are no longer threats alone. They become teachers, reflections, and reminders of what is unconscious within ourselves. Each encounter offers a choice: to participate in the unconscious drama, or to maintain awareness, integrity, and presence. I have seen people trapped by these archetypes for decades, moving from one relationship, one job, one social circle to another, unaware that the pattern follows them. They are like leaves caught in the wind, believing the wind is external, failing to recognize that they themselves generate the currents that shape their experience. Observation allows one to see the hidden mechanisms, to step out of the compulsive cycles, and to engage with life on one's own terms. This is the essence of freedom, not the absence of interaction with challenging personalities, but the ability to navigate consciously and deliberately, to choose engagement and to refuse unconscious participation. I have also seen how these archetypes manifest in society at large. Governments, organizations, and institutions are not immune to the same patterns. The perpetual victim becomes entire communities convinced of their helplessness. The manipulator becomes leaders shaping systems for hidden advantage. The crusader becomes movements insisting upon ideological certainty. The liar becomes media and narratives that bend reality to convenience. The user becomes networks and systems that extract value without reciprocity. The destroyer becomes forces of envy and sabotage that suppress collective potential. The chaos merchant becomes crises manufactured or perpetuated, compelling attention, energy, and reaction. Observing these patterns on a societal scale reinforces the necessity of clarity and conscious participation, for the stakes extend beyond personal energy to the very structure of human experience. I have found that the practice of awareness requires more than observation. It demands active cultivation of clarity, integrity, and presence. I have developed rituals of reflection, journaling, meditation, and deep immersion in nature, seeking to cleanse the mind of habitual patterns, to cultivate insight, and to align intention with perception. The archetypes remain ever present, but their power over me diminishes as conscious awareness grows. I have learned that each encounter is an opportunity for mastery, each observation a chance to reclaim agency, and each reflection a doorway into deeper consciousness. In my experience, one of the most profound revelations is that these archetypes are not fixed destinies, but dynamic energies, mutable and responsive to consciousness. The perpetual victim can find empowerment. The manipulator can develop empathy. The crusader can embrace humility. The liar can cultivate truth. The user can learn reciprocity, the destroyer can awaken compassion, and the chaos merchant can find stability. But this transformation is only possible when one first recognizes the pattern, both in oneself and in others, and when one engages with awareness, responsibility, and intentionality. The process is neither quick nor easy, for human psychology is layered, resistant, and complex. Yet the reward is profound: freedom from compulsion, clarity of perception, and mastery over one's own energy. I remember walking through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, observing the patterns of human interaction in cafes, classrooms, and homes, and reflecting on the universality of these archetypes. The perpetual victim exists in every generation. The manipulator adapts to new technologies and social norms. The crusader finds new causes and ideologies. The liar becomes increasingly subtle in media and politics. The user navigates networks with precision. The destroyer remains a shadow in every circle of brilliance, and the chaos merchant persists wherever attention and energy are plentiful. Recognition, observation, and conscious choice are the tools by which one navigates these forces. I have felt the subtle liberation that arises when one ceases to be pulled into the unconscious currents of these archetypes. Life becomes less about survival within the chaos and more about deliberate participation, less about being swept along by external forces and more about steering one's own vessel through the turbulent waters of existence. Energy is preserved, attention is focused, and the capacity to act with intention, creativity, and clarity is amplified. One becomes a conscious participant in the unfolding drama of life, rather than an unwitting actor in the repetition of archetypal patterns. As I integrate this understanding into my daily experience, I notice subtle shifts. I respond rather than react. I observe without absorbing. I participate without surrendering. I maintain boundaries with compassion. I recognize the archetypes in others without judgment, seeing them as expressions of human nature rather than moral failings. I see the archetypes within myself and approach them with honesty, courage, and discipline. The result is a life less entangled, more vivid, and profoundly more intentional. Freedom emerges not from avoiding challenges, but from understanding their structure, from recognizing patterns, and from acting with clarity amidst complexity. I have come to see that the ultimate lesson these archetypes teach is the necessity of self-awareness, the cultivation of conscious perception, and the embrace of responsibility for one's own energy and actions. Every interaction, every observation, every reflection becomes a practice, a step toward mastery. By recognizing the patterns in others, one gains the tools to navigate relationships effectively. By recognizing the patterns within oneself, one begins to transcend the unconscious repetition that binds so many lives. The journey is ongoing, a lifetime of observation, reflection, and conscious engagement. Yet each step brings deeper freedom, clarity, and insight. Ultimately, I understand now that trust, energy, and attention are sacred currencies. To give them freely is an act of generosity, but to do so without awareness is to risk depletion. Recognition of archetypes allows one to allocate energy wisely, to maintain integrity, and to participate consciously in the world. Compassion for others is deepened, not diluted, by the clarity of perception. Boundaries become tools for preservation rather than walls of separation. Awareness is liberation. Observation is power. Conscious choice is freedom. And so I continue watching, learning, reflecting, and navigating. The perpetual victim remains. The manipulator persists. The crusader marches. The liar adapts. The user calculates. The destroyer reacts. And the chaos merchant rages. But I move through their presence with clarity, holding my energy, maintaining my center, and acting in alignment with conscious intention. The world remains a complex interplay of forces, but within this complexity lies the possibility of mastery, the opportunity for liberation, and the profound realization that the ultimate authority over experience resides within the observer. I have discovered that the most extraordinary freedom comes not from changing the world around me, but from transforming my perception of it. By observing, understanding, and engaging with archetypal patterns consciously, I reclaim energy that would otherwise be lost, maintain clarity where confusion might reign, and act in a way that is deliberate, intentional, and deeply aligned with awareness. Every encounter becomes an opportunity, every relationship a mirror, and every moment a chance to exercise conscious agency. I have come to understand that life, in its infinite complexity, is both a teacher and a canvas. The archetypes I have described, victim, manipulator, crusader, liar, user, destroyer, chaos, merchant, are not enemies but reflections, challenges, and invitations to awaken. They exist to test clarity, resilience, and conscious choice. And as I navigate this landscape, I realize that the greatest power lies not in avoidance, resistance, or control, but in understanding, observation, and alignment with conscious intention. Each day becomes an opportunity to engage with life fully, to act from awareness, and to cultivate freedom amidst the patterns that shape existence. I have learned that the path to mastery is not external, it is interior. It is the cultivation of attention, the recognition of patterns, the commitment to honesty, and the courage to act with clarity and integrity. Awareness becomes a shield and a tool. Observation becomes a form of liberation. And conscious choice becomes the key to navigating the currents of human behavior without losing oneself. In the end, I understand that the ultimate journey is toward consciousness itself, toward freedom from unconscious repetition, and toward the profound realization that the authority over one's life, energy, and perception rests entirely within.